My research project is on ancient Egyptian and modern American embalming, a comparative case study. So what does that entail? What I really want to talk about is I want to go through a comprehensive analysis of embalming in ancient Egypt, and that includes both the scientific and social aspects of embalming, and then do the same for embalming as we know it today. And then following that, I want to go through some comparisons, some similarities, and draw some conclusions from the data that we've reviewed. So let's start with embalming in ancient Egypt. So the development of embalming in ancient Egypt likely evolved from the natural preservation of hunted fish or game in Egypt's hot climate, because it's such a dry, arid country. Um, Really, the best way to preserve any sort of food was through drying, and then also, like tanning hides and whatnot. So likely they drew on knowledge that hunters and fishers sort of gathered naturally through their professions to try to gain a sort of abundance of food. So pre-dynastic, and we're talking very, very early on, pre-dynastic death customs typically involved leaving the deceased in a shallow grave in the sands to desiccate, so to let all the moisture escape from the body, which sort of leaves behind a leatherized tissue. And then as civilization and religion developed, class distinctions began to emerge, and artificial embalming methods were sought. So sort of as these preservation methods became more successful, specifically with regards to food, the surplus of food allowed civilization to thrive. As civilization thrived, things began to emerge like money, religion, power, status, and all of these sort of tied together to demand a higher, longer lasting form of embalming. So as religion developed, this is reflected in religious myth. So the first to be embalmed, according to ancient Egyptian mythology, was the god Osiris by the god Anubis, who would from then on be viewed as the god of funeral rites and the afterlife and whatnot. So the way that Anubis embalmed Osiris was laid out in religious text, and so the embalming techniques that we see later as Egypt continued to develop sort of reflect and mirror its mythological origin. And then just another point that I thought would be interesting to bring up, I read that one attempt to prevent decomposition was to place the body in a coffin made of a single piece of stone with a tight lid. In such burials, subsequently, the servants of the cemeteries and relatives ran into the remains, which completely turned into skeletons. Not knowing the scientific explanation of the decomposition of organic compounds in decay, they were sure that the stone coffins eat soft tissues, which is the origin of the word sarcophagus. Sarco as in flesh or tissue, and phagus as in consume. So that is why sarcophagi are known as sarcophagi, even as that sort of belief evolved beyond that point. I just thought that was interesting. So as we reach the middling dynasties, they've sort of got their embalming techniques down to a science, so to speak. So one paper that I read breaks down ancient Egyptian embalming. There's 4 levels of embalming. Each is sort of more complex and more efficient than the lower levels. So I just want to go over the highest level to start off with. So the first step would be to remove the brain, typically with some sort of like spoon or hook. And then the cranial cavity would be packed with resin. Following this, the abdomen would be incised and the internal organs would be removed and placed in canopic jars like these right over here. And then following that, the body cavity would be packed with natron, which we'll discuss more in a little bit, as well as other sort of like herbs and oils and whatnot. And then it would sit in this salt compound for 20 to 70 days. Then following that, the body is removed from this sort of immersion bath. It's cleaned, straightened out, dehydrated via sun exposure. And then following that, the body is wrapped and placed in a sarcophagus or multiple sarcophagi, as became common in later periods. So what is the primary mechanism of embalming in ancient Egypt? As we've sort of made clear already, the primary mechanism is really dehydration, right? Like the primary goal here is to remove all moisture. So the mechanism of this desiccation was natron or natron, I don't know. But it's a naturally occurring salt mixture. It shows up in like dried lake beds and whatnot. It was pretty easily accessible in ancient Egypt. So it includes a lot of different salts. We've got sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, potassium nitrate, some other salts. And it's hygroscopic, which means that it readily takes up and retains moisture. So what it's really doing is it's interacting with the moisture in the tissue and drawing it out, which, in modern embalming, we have compounds that do similar things. And then another thing it does is it saponifies adipose tissue, which is a chemical process which converts fats into a hard, waxy substance called adipocere. Interestingly enough, this is the same process that is used to create soaps most of the time. But again, what that does is it helps remove that moisture, and then by converting adipose tissue into adipocere, it's sort of forming another sealing layer on sort of the inner layers just below the dermis. So that's really the primary method of the actual embalming process. Once that's complete, the other primary mechanism is sealing, right? So after the body is totally dehydrated, completely desiccated to the best of their ability, they seal it. So the body's covered in oils, and then the bandages are coated in a resin, right? So sort of like a natural adhesive, a natural sealing glue, right? Like, for example, if you look at like tree resin or like amber coming out of trees, it starts off as sort of a liquid, and then it hardens, it seals. So they would use some tree resins like guaiacic resin, which also contains, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, guaiacol, which is a phenolic compound, something that we're also familiar nowadays, and bitumen, which is also known as tar in its liquid state. They would use that to coat the bandages as well, which is also why a lot of mummies now look completely black, because they were essentially coated in tar. So those really helped to seal the bodies of the deceased. They were wrapped in, sometimes I believe, like 1,200 to 1,500 yards of fabric, all wrapped in, or all dipped in these resins and tar. So that is a pretty well sealed deceased, as well as having some bactericidal properties, especially the resins and the oils that they would also put in there. So what was the purpose of embalming in ancient Egypt? So the purpose of embalming was almost entirely religious. I hope my microphone's recording. According to ancient Egyptian religion, the body had to be preserved for 3,000 years. And during this 3,000 years, the soul leaves the body and goes on a 3,000-year-old journey, and then it needs to have an intact body to return to rise again, and to join the gods. So that was really the primary purpose, is to make sure the body would last for essentially eternity, right? Like as long as they could conceive of. Um, the second purpose would be cleansing. So, according to the mythology, Anubis would only allow souls with cleaned bodies to join him in the underworld, as well as a lot of the herbs, the oils would have a pleasing scent. For example, they would put some cinnamon in there, and so that scent was supposed to sort of attract Anubis and let him know that this was a cleaned decedent sort of being offered up, being prepared for their journey. And so, in sort of more technical terms, the preservation of the body allowed preservation of the soul. As Snare 2020 says, if the body perished, the Ba and Ka also ceased to exist, thereby destroying any connection with the living world. The Ba and Ka being components of the ancient Egyptian idea of the human soul, which would sort of continue to interact with the living world, even as sort of the heart of the person took this 3,000-year-old journey. So all in all, long-term preservation was the end-all be-all goal. So how available was embalming? And this is a part that I found really interesting, because I've been under the impression that we have these huge pyramids, we have the Sphinx. Mummies are really popular in sort of popular mythology, as just being like kings and queens, sort of like nobility, right? And while there's an element of truth to that, it actually seems like it was surprisingly accessible at a price. So the highest level, which we described earlier, was made available to nobles, and finished with an entombed, multi-line sarcophagus. So what I mean by that, it's not just the body is sealed and wrapped and placed into one stone sarcophagus. It's usually multiple layers, like 3 or 4 or a dozen, or maybe one of like pure gold right on the inside, right? Like I think that's how Tutankhamun was preserved, and then multiple stone layers outside of that, or copper or bronze as the years went on. So that's the highest level. The second level takes away the abdominal incision. Oil and caustic soda are introduced to the body via the anus to destroy the viscera, followed by the natron bath, like the immersion in the salts, drying and wrapping. So this is what I found interesting, because it talks about the body being intact, but it also seems like the ancient Egyptians didn't really care for a lot of the internal organs. So their treatment was more of a set them aside or destroy them and it's fine. So third level, immersion in caustic soda, dried and wrapped. Again, sort of taking away more levels. Followed by the fourth level, was to just immerse the body in hot tar for several days, dry them and wrap them. And this, compared to the highest level, it's not all that much, but compared to what we do nowadays, I think its efficacy can't really be questioned, in consideration to what we do today. But obviously, higher levels directly correlate with better preservation. Better preservation correlates religiously with better treatment, better odds for the soul to have a good outcome. So the higher castes of society still sort of got it better in the end, so to speak. So that's ancient Egypt. Let's switch over to embalming today for a second. Modern embalming has its roots in the 1800s with the anatomists of Europe, specifically France and Belgium. As sort of modern science developed, the need to understand the human body in a way outside of the theological grew in demand. And so people needed to study cadavers. Cadavers tend to decompose if they're not treated. So through a lot of different experimentation, trial and error, arterial embalming was developed. Came over here in the mid 1800s, really got popularized during the Civil War because troops would travel far away, they would die, they would need to be preserved somehow so that they could be returned home via train and have a funeral where possible. So that's where modern embalming really got its start. And it was sort of mass popularized by the embalming of Abraham Lincoln, which was one of the most public events in American history, I would say. They took his body on a tour of the country, on this train you can see in the background. He stayed well embalmed for quite some time. I think hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of people were able to view him. So that really sold embalming to the modern, at that time, audience. And then it became a staple of death care after that. So methodology, we're familiar with this, not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's 4 primary techniques. Obviously, arterial embalming comes first. Preservative fluid is injected into major arteries, circulates the cardiovascular system, distributes into the tissues, and bodily fluids, blood, lymph, and stomach purge, cerebrospinal fluid, whatever, anything that comes out is drained where possible. Cavity embalming, we aspirate the thoracic cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity, aspirate liquid and gas out of them, put preservative fluid in to coat the internal viscera that aren't touched by arterial embalming. And then we have supplemental treatments of hypodermic, using needles to preserve tissues that haven't been touched by any other embalming yet. And then surface embalming, where we need to treat the dermis, the epidermis, anywhere that is just, giving us a struggle sometimes. So that's all of the time I'm going to spend on that. The primary mechanism of embalming today really revolves around preservation. So formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, other aldehydes, they form the basis of our sort of main arterial fluids, right? And what they do is they cross-link amino acids. They form these methylene bridges, which prevent the proteins from denaturing the way they naturally would. It prevents autolytic decomposition. So it doesn't allow changes in pH or anything to act on the cells and destroy them any farther than they've already been destroyed. So what it really does is just transform decomposing matter into inert matter. The formaldehyde is consumed in the process. The proteins sort of cease to be proteins at that point as well. And then along with that, it also has other benefits. It's antiseptic, it's bactericidal, it's disinfecting, and I think most importantly for us, it preserves tissue while maintaining natural form. And then obviously we have supplemental chemicals that are used for color, dehydration or rehydration, adding or taking away scent, additional preservative qualities, additional germicidal qualities, etc., etc. but really our embalming is focused on preservation. So what's the purpose of embalming? Why do we embalm? So originally, like I said earlier, the purpose was to preserve the body so that the family of the deceased could travel for the funeral, or so that the deceased could be transported back to their home, since America is such a large country, so that the funeral could be held once people were gathered and once the body was present. Today, that's still pretty much the same. I would argue that our primary purpose today is to restore and maintain a natural appearance, with I guess a emphasis on maintain. We don't want a poorly embalmed body that looks good for a day. We want a body that'll last at least a couple of weeks. And we want to maintain that for a family or public viewing, and preserve the body for that time. Embalming today, it does not stop decomposition permanently. That is never the goal, I wouldn't say. The embalmed body will likely mummify or decompose within a decade, maybe longer, depending on conditions. But really, at that point, our job is done, right? The rapid short-term preservation of appearance is, in most cases, the number one priority. So let's talk availability of embalming. The median cost of a funeral, according to the NFDA in 2021, is almost $8,000. Average cost of embalming around $775. Probably ranges from about $300 to $1,000, depending on region of the country. In 2019, the Federal Reserve recorded that about 40% of Americans can't afford an unexpected expense of $400. So, $8,000 or $775 is a bit more than $400. So, while we don't have the formal class distinctions that the Egyptians did, and embalming is, legally available to anyone with the means to pay for it. Really, the number of people who can pay for it or are willing to pay for it continues to drop in the modern day, especially to lower income families or those with small families that can't split the burden of a funeral, those who don't have pre-planned funerals or prepaid funerals. So it's sort of a trade-off, right? Embalming is more available than ever, and we offer the same level of service when it comes to embalming to every family that walks in the door. But whether or not they'll choose it, is statistically declining. Primarily, it seems, for economic reasons. So let's get into some comparisons. So let's talk about chemical action first. In Egyptian embalming, desiccation, complete dehydration of tissue, was the primary action of chemicals. Whereas in the modern day, we focus entirely on preservation of form. We do not want a desiccated body. That is one of the last things we could possibly want. Ancient Egyptian embalming sort of comes from hot, dry climate, evolves from that sort of fact of life very naturally, whereas our embalming today comes from about 1,000 years, like post-Renaissance, of anatomical considerations and the necessity for tissue preservation. So in ancient Egypt, the embalming is supposed to last for 3,000 years. Today, embalming is supposed to take place immediately post-mortem, as opposed to taking like 3 months post-mortem. and typically never really needs to last for longer than a month, right? Um, I think one of the biggest differences is Egyptian embalming has absolutely no concern for post-embalming appearance. All of that is done once the deceased is in their sarcophagus. All the sort of external decoration is where appearance is really concerned. Whereas today we focus on having a excuse me, very lifelike appearance um, immediately afterwards for the funeral. And then, like I said, Egyptian embalming relies on the whole removal of moisture from the deceased and formation of adipocere, whereas embalming today relies on the fixative action of aldehydes on proteins and drainage of fluid, but not the entire moisture content from the deceased. Okay, back to availability of embalming. So there's definitely trade-offs here on both sides. So embalming in ancient Egypt was available to most people. Differences in the level of embalming, the four levels that we talked about, um, were those levels were sort of set by price, with the least complex being the cheapest, obviously. But the way price worked, it was not a flat rate. The families and survivors of the deceased would negotiate with the sort of funeral priests, and just sort of figure out what they could pay for what level of embalming they desired. Both parties walked away satisfied, so it sort of worked out. And it was essentially required by religion, right? Like if you're not embalming the body, then the body wastes away, and the soul of your loved one, which is very much still active in society, watching over your family and blessing you and taking your worries to the gods and whatnot. If the body fades away, the soul fades away. So it was pretty much demanded that every decedent would be embalmed. On the other hand, embalming in the United States, like I said, is available to most people, but price or the perception of price often turns people away from it. And especially recently, I would say a majority of religions, maybe that's not true, but in the United States, where the majority of people are Christian, or some variety of a Christian denomination, and those denominations mostly accept embalming, nowadays mostly accept cremation, as cremation and other alternate forms of disposition become more widespread, cheaper, and culturally accepted. Embalming becomes less universally necessitated and or available. So again, it's sort of a trade-off. It is legally available. It's on everyone's GPL. Yes. So, to me, this is the most interesting slide. These are some of the most interesting conclusions that I've been able to draw, reflecting the social purpose and the reflection of societal values found in embalming. So, as we said, Egyptian embalming serves long-term religious and cultural purposes. Survival of the body was paramount for apotheosis of the deceased, as in the body needs to survive for 3,000 years for the soul to return to it, and then the deceased to join the gods, right? So death, being more commonplace in the Bronze Age, obviously, was seen as a continuation of the journey of the soul. So this made me wonder, would grieving be the same? And I sort of suspect there's some differences because once once the deceased is brought to the embalming temple, then they are never seen in that state again by their family or by their loved ones. Um, when they come out, they are fully wrapped at the very least, and likely entombed in a sarcophagus. So does that lack of sort of final sight on the deceased body leave some sort of lack of closure for the survivors? But I don't think so, because the conspicuousness of the embalming priests as sort of like high members of society um, would counteract this. I think, like if you know that your loved one is going to be in the hands of these people who are highly connected to the gods, who are doing everything that you've paid for to handle the body and the soul of your deceased loved one. I think that offers a completely different type of closure, but at a similar level to something that we would hope for in the modern day. So I don't necessarily think that would inhibit grief. I just think it would be a different process. Um, on the other hand, American embalming serves short-term presentational purposes for personal closure and relatively immediate funeral rites. So preservation of the deceased for the purpose of appropriate, quote unquote, lifelike presentation to the survivors. And this is something that is uh, present across, I would say, every funeral custom that we've um, uh, studied in class, right? Like these are, I think all modern societies are thanatophobic in some way. Like we are fundamentally scared of death. The funeral profession is not a conspicuous member of society. We are not talked about with anything outside of like superstition most of the time. And so people don't really know what goes on behind closed doors, and not in the same way that they had faith in the ancient Egyptian priest class, but more so they don't know what's going on with the deceased body, and they don't necessarily want to know. And when they see their deceased loved one again, they don't want to think about the fact that they're dead or see any hint of what may have killed them. Like we remove jaundice stain, we wax over trauma, um, we we reattach limbs. Like we do what we can to make the person look like they did in life, whole and complete. And if they're old, very likely better than they have in the last 5 or 10 years. And that's what people want to see. That's what they expect to see. And all this sort of serves to hide away the fact of death. And this is this is a quote that I found in a paper about the sociological aspects of death and embalming in modern England. As the dead are carefully represented, this has hidden the true condition of the dead, and therefore also hidden the covert technicians, embalmers, who accomplish this transformation. Embalming therefore appears a hidden aspect of the social construct of the dead, as death is now estranged from the popular context. Um, and like even the cultures that take a more immediate approach to dealing with death, for example, like Jewish funeral rites or Muslim funeral rites, um, where they wrap the body, they cover the body. The first thing they do is try to fully clean the body and remove any purge, remove any view of like bodily fluids, anything that points to something being wrong, and try to present this like sort of pure unsullied view of death, which, as we know, working with death, that is not what death is at all. Death is not pure. It is not neat. It is messy and sometimes a little gross. And people in modern society don't really like coming to terms with that or thinking about it ever. Um, so I wouldn't, I can't morally call that a bad thing, right? I don't think that reflects on our societies poorly. That's just where we are right now. And I think that that's an interesting conclusion that this led me to. So that's all I have. I know this was a really long presentation. I hope that my microphone actually worked so I don't have to record another 35 minutes. And here's my works cited, and we are done.